Welcome to the NZIIA podcast. Here we talk all things international, from trade to geopolitics to diplomacy. The NZIIA seeks to encourage an understanding of the importance of global affairs to the political and economic well-being of New Zealand, as in this interconnected age, what happens beyond these shores affects us all at home.
Kia ora and welcome to the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs Youth Panel podcast. My name is Philip McFadden, and on this episode we will be discussing climate change with our guest, youth climate activist Ri Theodore. Thank you for coming on the show. For our audience, could you just briefly describe what your role has been as a youth climate activist and perhaps how long you've been involved in this role?
Absolutely. Kia ora. Thank you for having me. So my role as a youth climate activist currently is I am part of the organising committee for lots of different climate-related organisations. So I currently sit as the co-president of the Victoria University Climate Clinic, and I'm also a co-founder, co-president, officer, whatever we call them, of the Students for Climate Solutions, which is an organisation that we founded last year to further our work in the legal policy climate sphere. So I do a lot of legal-based work. I do a lot of scientific research, legal prep. We're in the middle of a couple lawsuits at the moment, which is really exciting. I do lots of press and campaigning for other climate-based lawsuits and organizations. And I do lots of local work with my wonderful executives in the Wellington area, as well as nationally. Anything we can get our hands on, we do. But most of it is centered around legal policy because lots of our executive are made up of law and international relations and policy students. So that's my current role as a youth activist. I started being a youth climate activist back in my final year of high school, I want to say, when a lot of the momentum was generating in youth activism. I was on the Climate Challenge Committee, which organizes a conference for young people. Pretty much been in the space ever since, and my degree is very much focused on becoming a climate litigator.
Wow, that really does sound like a lot of work. Just for our audience at home, often there's some confusion between what climate change is and what global warming is. Is there any overlap between the two, and what are the key differences?
Absolutely. They're very interrelated in my experience, and I guess in the scientific consensus that I've grown to understand. So climate change is the overall phenomenon of the change in the global average temperature, which is increasing, which is the nature and the phenomenon of global warming. And that has a lot of flow-on adverse effects, especially in terms of increasing sea level rise through the air temperature and the water temperature increasing. And of course, that makes things expand. So things that expand in the water tend to get bigger and therefore encroach on land. So they're very interrelated terms, but climate change definitely is able to encapsulate more of the variation, especially in floods, droughts, extreme weather events, and everything. So you can lump everything that's under climate change under global warming, but they're very interrelated and they feed off each other.
That's great to know. Thank you. As many people know, in 2015, the United Nations had put forward the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which now includes up to 193 nations, including New Zealand, with the collective goal to prevent the global rise in temperature and keep it well below 2 degrees. So my question is, do you believe that New Zealand is upholding these standards from the Paris Accord? And if not, how can we improve on that?
Good question. I think we are not doing our absolute best in terms of upholding the agreement set out in the Paris Accord. Obviously, there's a big 2050 target of net zero emissions by that point, so we shouldn't have any more carbon emissions that are adversely affecting the global weather patterns by 2050. In order to reach that goal, you absolutely have to start doing action now, because pretty much any warming that takes place after 2030 is irreversible, and we really can't get back to limiting to under 2 and definitely under 1.5 by that point. In terms of where we are lacking the most, obviously it's very hard to transition to a net zero emissions economy. There's lots of things you have to do. There's lots of public buy-in you have to get. There's quite a bit of legislation you have to pass. But I think that only really starts with people making the moves and the public being open to that huge transitional change that we have to go to. And I think the major thing that we're missing is limiting the pollution and emissions that come from major companies, because obviously 70% of the world's climate emissions come from the top 100 companies, and lots of these are farming and energy based. So until we get that under control, we are kind of screwed for the Paris Accord being adhered to.
I guess on that note, My question would be, is there any way small countries like New Zealand can hold larger nations who contribute more to these carbon emissions?
I think it's obviously difficult for small nations who may not have a lot of diplomatic buy-in, especially compared to countries like the US, like China, like Russia, who, because of the scale that they exist on, obviously have a lot larger emissions rates. But New Zealand is a surprisingly high emitter considering our size. I think we're one of the worst in the OECD, actually. And so I think acknowledging that our fault, obviously not just our own, but of others, but acknowledging that the fault is our own, that we have to take certain measures to mitigate that fault, and just doing the action that is really necessary. Probably, I don't want to say inspire. I feel like inspire is a very loose word in this situation, but for lack of a better term, motivates those other countries to take similar actions. I think if we don't start and we wait for these big countries to act, we're never going to get anywhere. So you might as well start domestically and hope that flows on to these larger emitters who we do have diplomatic ties with, trade a lot with, things like this. But I think it's an excuse that has been used for a long time that, oh, we're just small and we don't have all this diplomatic buy-in, so we don't need to do X, Y, and Z. I think it's a flimsy excuse and basically just mitigates our public want for change.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, especially considering that one of the greatest fears we have with climate change is the new and extreme weather patterns it brings on. I mean, one of the effects that we get from these extreme weather patterns, as we've seen in Australia between 2019 and 2020, known as the Black Summer, approximately about 24 million hectares, that's 59 million acres of land was burned down. This is an area larger than the size of France. More recently, in Pakistan, as we've seen, 1/3 of the country is underwater due to what the United Nations found to be caused by glacier melting, unprecedented monsoon rains, and this seemed to all compile together into an ultimate, almost apocalyptic event. So the United Nations ended up releasing a statement saying, tomorrow it could be your country. So I guess my question is, how likely are these events to occur in the future of New Zealand?
I think, I'm not sure of the exact statistics of our potential sea level rise, but it's not good. Obviously, we're not as low-lying as atoll compared to other Pacific islands. We're significantly larger than some of the Pacific islands who will be completely submerged with the melting of the various glaciers in the Arctic and Antarctic. But we're definitely going to see a degree of our coast slipping away. We already see a lot of coastal erosion happening, especially on the upper east coast of the North Island, in the Taranaki region specifically. You can see there's lots of jagged cliffs that just do not happen naturally, and they're happening because the water is so strong and it's rising at such a rate that takes away land. So I think there's definitely maps out there that demonstrate the projected flooding based on which major glaciers are going to melt. So no matter what amount of warming that we see, I think even with the 1 degree increase that we've currently had since pre-industrial levels, we are seeing a few millimeters every year. From memory, it's 2.5 millimeters per year sea level rise in New Zealand. So that obviously gradually takes away the coast, and that's just with global warming in its not completely apocalyptic way. And when we see these glaciers melt, well, it'll be significantly bigger into the meters. So we'll take a lot of coast from that.
It definitely does seem quite terrifying, especially since, I bet as you can agree, the effects of flooding result in things like bloodborne diseases, all these outbreaks, as well as power grids shutting down. I mean, it doesn't seem to really stop. Who are some of the most at-risk communities then to these effects of climate change? Or do you believe that rather than some communities being more at risk, everyone experiences it equally?
Excellent question. I think there is no equitable experience of climate change. Very specific communities will be targeted because of either where they are positioned financially in the world or where they are positioned geographically. Obviously, coastal communities will suffer adversely compared to others because they will quite literally see the land beneath them go away. A lot of these communities are either Māori or Pacifica communities who have lots of local and important, significant cultural ties to the land are in these places. Other low socioeconomic communities that just do not have the resources to effectively mitigate or manage or adapt to climate change. If you don't have a lot of money, you probably aren't going to be able to move if your house floods, things like this. Any community that is currently already vulnerable in the socioeconomic world is going to experience climate change at a increasingly disadvantageous rate.
Do you think that the developed nations of the world are in fact investing the right amount into countries which might not be able to afford all this renewable energy or technology that's now coming to fruition?
From my knowledge of current development aid projects and what they are currently funding, it's definitely not anywhere near enough to have effective mitigation and adaptation strategies put in place for either their own nations or other nations that they give aid to. So yeah, I don't think that developed nations are contributing enough of their own GDP to, especially in terms of the amount of emissions that they've caused, is definitely disproportionate in how it affects less developed countries or countries that are not considered to be in the developed world. Unfortunately, I don't have a plan in terms of how much money you should be investing. I think it's somewhere obviously in the millions, but it's very exciting to see, at least in some places, companies that are giving up a lot of money that governments are not doing. For example, the recent Patagonia shift from their company, I think completely selling all of their shares, both their voting shares and their non-voting shares, and putting them into a specific trust that funnels money directly into climate initiatives. And I believe that even from now on, all of the profits obtained from Patagonia, which is approximately like 100 million a year, are going into that specific trust that funnels money into climate initiatives worldwide, especially in terms of land that is at risk and communities that are also therefore at risk of experiencing climate change at an accelerated rate. So someone's doing something, but governments are definitely not doing enough.
Recently, we've seen Tuvalu, an island nation who has requested that the government of New Zealand increases the amount of investment to protect them from these effects of climate change, mainly to do with rising sea levels. So why are specifically island nations a lot more vulnerable to the effects of rising sea levels than some others?
The main reasons are geographic reasons, and that's because a lot of Pacific islands are what's called low-lying atolls, so they are incredibly close to the sea level, and that means that when sea level rise increases, it takes more of their land at a faster rate. That is conflated with a lot of the socioeconomic inequalities that we see in these nations because they've had histories of rampant colonization, Western and developed world countries constantly trying to extract resources from them for small amounts of profits and large amounts of gain in the Western world. So they've just experienced a lot of uprooting in more ways than one, which makes them more vulnerable to climate change. First of all, from the geographic standpoint that I've explained, but then that's exacerbated in their ability to paint Pacific countries and countries in low-lying areas as unable to cope with climate change on anything of their own accord, but it's because they've been subject to such rampant rates of colonization and exploitation that they aren't able to adapt and mitigate effectively because they just do not have the resources to. And that's obviously the fault of the Western world.
Of course, a lot of this disproportion we're seeing, I mean, it seems almost unfair, and well, it is very unfair and unequal that the countries which have contributed the least to what we've now seen climate change become, facing the brunt of this impact. Even going back to talking about Pakistan, they contributed to only less than 1% of global emissions in the world, and yet we've seen what's happened there currently. It does seem that these apocalyptic events are really on our doorstep, and if they're not occurring now, they're at least going to occur a lot more frequently in the future. So what is the real time frame we have to minimize these emissions before the rate of climate change becomes too detrimental to overcome?
Absolutely. I think it's obviously hitting faster than we ever really anticipated. We get these reports every 4 to 6 years from the IPCC saying it's getting much worse, and the longer you take the act, the worse it's going to get. I'm pretty sure from my experience in the climate world that 2030 is the cutoff date for irreversibility. So we have 8 years to get all the plans in place and to start reducing emissions now before we actually can't backtrack. And that's when I believe everything becomes even more accelerated. But obviously lots of the projections that we have are into the 100 years. So I think a lot of people get the idea that they're not going to be alive then, so they don't really need to worry about changing their lifestyle or pressuring companies to change the economic lifestyle that everyone has to buy into because of the framing of climate change. But we can see it now. It's going to get much worse in the years to come, and even much worse in the generations to come.
And I guess this whole idea of governments not doing enough or rolling back is even evident in our legislation. If you look at the Climate Act, right after they set the target goal to reduce the net zero carbon emissions by 2050, the next section of that act actually discusses ways in which we can further push back that date because we haven't reached our goals. So in your experience, what do you believe that are some of the most critical improvements society needs to make to combat these effects of climate change?
I think the most effective changes that can be made that starts with legislation is legislating companies who are high emitters to explicitly not be high emitters. So whether that's banning the type of resources that they use, fossil fuels, or changing the nature of their markets. So obviously agriculture and energy emits a lot because of the need to mine coal and natural gas to create energy and needing cows to produce dairy to have, and that emits methane, changing the nature in the way that we do farming and do energy. So that's switching to renewables, that's having much more sustainable farming practices and things like that. And I think once you make those large-scale legislative changes, I think that has a greater impact to have flow-on effects to change society, because I really feel like demand has to change before supply does. And even saying that, we're already seeing supply change with people wanting, alternative products to dairy products, people wanting alternative fuels to be used in their energy production and things like this. So I feel like the demand is already there and the supply just needs to catch up. I feel like it is a little fruitless blaming individuals for their everyday individual choices when the infrastructure for things like waste management and other such types of pollution don't actually exist. In New Zealand, for example, we do not have a nationalized waste management system, and we see our landfills get bigger and bigger each year. I remember in my first year of uni, I did a research project on the Wellington landfill, and it's gotten to a point where they've had to increase it so much because of individual household waste increasing that it might even encroach on NZIIA, which is just the upper-teenth example of hypocritical. So I think large-scale infrastructure changes need to be made, but I also think we shouldn't blame individuals. We should definitely blame some individuals for their choices. You don't need an SUV in Wellington or, frankly, any other inner city to get around. The amount of the individuals who are high emitters in comparison to other individuals is ridiculous. And obviously you can only really be a high emitter to the scale that I'm talking about if you are a wealthy individual. So I think most of the change needs to happen structurally, but obviously some individually targeted legislation needs to happen. So there was this bill going through, or this ban on certain types of cars. I don't even know where that is in terms of the legislative timeline at this point, but something like that would be very useful for changing individual choices.
I mean, I'm sure in your experience as a youth climate activist, it must be hard being able to get the older generation more involved. Do you know of any way we can actually increase the amount of, for lack of a better term, older generation to participate more?
I always wonder why the older generation doesn't care as much. Obviously, there's the one narrative, they're not going to live to see the main and concrete and hugely adverse effects of climate change. But most people have children, and those children will probably also have children. So I feel like you owe a duty to even your own grandchildren to, be a better person in terms of championing climate change efforts. I think the only way that you get a lot of intergenerational activism, instead of pressuring, I think you bring them along, is the narrative that I think is best to sell in this situation. And I think that starts with your own inner circle. But I think gaining and improving knowledge in your own inner circle. So whether that's with your parents and then your grandparents and then the older people in your life, people are going to be much more inclined to change their behaviors if it's from someone they trust, if you're doing it in a way that's not attacking their views per se, if you're bringing them along and into the space rather than ostracizing them from the movement, I think is the best way to get more older people on the climate change activist boat.
Well, I really can't argue with that. So just for the people at home, because it often feels as though these events are just going to happen and you might get overwhelmed with this feeling of just defeatism. What do you think is something that inspires you every day to think and also hold on to this hope for a better future and that improvement will come?
I've definitely struggled with the idea of climate anxiety and defeatism a lot. And I think everybody in the sphere does, because you're constantly surrounded by bad news and by things that you have to change and people that you have to essentially fight with. All of my activism is essentially battles. They're in courtrooms, they're in protests, all these things. I honestly don't know what makes me tick in that sense. I think it's just the fact that if I didn't, I would feel so much worse. And I often say I would much rather do other things with my time than think about climate change. I would much rather do quite literally anything else than go to court for climate activism. And although all of it is exciting and it's nice to be moving and shaking in this space, I shouldn't have to be the one to do this, and young people shouldn't have to be the people who champion all of this change, because we're just growing up. We should not have to think about this scale of existentialism so early on, because it is bad for us to constantly think of bad things. So I guess I don't really have a direct answer in what hope I have. I just think that there is no alternative for me, even though I would really like there to be.
Turning back to the topic of the most at-risk communities, I would just like to acknowledge the fact that neither myself or my guest is tangata whenua. We'll do our best to respect our audience. So how can New Zealand, do you think, better incorporate Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles in this battle against climate change?
Absolutely. I think it's a really important question for looking at our national obligations. Great to disclaim that obviously we're both tangata tiriti, and therefore our role is upholding the Treaty of Waitangi and Te Tiriti o Waitangi specifically. And that obviously means highlighting and making space and actively including Māori, mana whenua and tangata whenua into every conversation, not just relevant conversations. And I think especially in terms of climate change and in terms of how it will adversely impact Māori disproportionately because of all the reasons that we've discussed and all the other reasons that exist as well. I think the best thing that we can do as treaty partners is to actively make space for Māori and to actively include them and make them in charge of things that pertain to their experiences and what they know best. Obviously, both of us and a lot of people in Parliament making the decisions that need to be made are tangata tiriti. And essentially what that means is we've all signed up in that sense to our founding document, and that includes upholding all of the 3 articles that pertain to taonga, tino rangatiratanga, everything that upholds Māori kaupapa. And so I think the biggest role for tangata tiriti, and in my experience what I've always tried to champion, is highlight Māori issues, not necessarily because they're Māori issues, but because they affect people who we should care about. I think a lot of the reason that things have gone wrong in the climate space that pertain to Māori issues are because people are always trying to come in and usurp and essentially recolonize spaces and take opportunities away from Māori people. And I think on one hand, that's just unhelpful practically. And on the second hand, it's unhelpful in terms of upholding those obligations. So I think making the most amount of space for Māori and recognizing that we care about mana whenua and tangata whenua because they are people who live here and who have lived here much longer than a lot of the colonial and everything under that boat has existed. And they have incredibly valuable knowledge and ways of life and ways of understanding and doing things that are actively helpful to fighting climate change. So I think make space for them and listen to them.
This whole idea about the geographical location of a lot of maraes even, what I highly recommend actually is if you look at the Takiwai map, it is a projection which shows you the most areas where we're going to see a lot of rising sea levels. You can highlight the location of the maraes in those areas, and it is astoundingly scary when you truly see this. A lot of the projected rising sea level does happen along these coastal located maraes, and I can't imagine the detriment on the people living in those areas. So just talking about these at-risk communities, I mean, even the United Nations found that climate change even affects women more than men, bearing an unequal role in providing for their family, to there being fewer females in decision-making processes. Have you seen this through your experience as a youth climate activist?
Absolutely. And disclaimer, I take law and geography, and I'm kind of surrounded with the interaction of those two ideas a lot. And I've attended a lot of lectures that explore the idea of how different communities are impacted adversely by climate change, and it definitely has addressed the ways in which women are impacted adversely. I think in my own personal experience, a lot of the youth climate world is full of really powerful women. So I think in terms of going forward, we're in very good hands with who I see in the youth space. I don't necessarily know how we in my spheres have experienced that inequality, so to speak, but I definitely know in the research that I'm involved in, just the amount of studies that I've had to read and how it affects women elsewhere in the world. I think it's especially interesting that that doesn't seem as well highlighted as potentially other vulnerable communities. Obviously, it's not a competition of who's the most vulnerable and who can we recognize the most in literature. But I think it just goes to show the invisibility of a lot of the climate issues and how they affect people in different ways. So I think when you look at how women and women identifying people experience climate change differently, I think it actually does open a lot of doors and pathways into understanding how that disproportionate effect actually works.
So one of the questions I need to ask is, who are the major contributors in New Zealand to the pollution we face, which will adversely affect climate and then climate change?
We have quite a few lists out there. I think the most recent one was published earlier this year. Off the top of my head, our biggest emitters are Fonterra, Silverfern Farms, Z Energy, and a couple other energy and agricultural related institutions. And obviously that's because they exist in markets and fields that profit exclusively off creating emissions. So if you're in the energy business, it's a lot cheaper to mine coal and to mine gas as it stands than invest in renewable energies, even though that economic argument is very much dismal in the long term. So obviously, the slower you take to transition to renewables, the more fossil fuels get emitted into the atmosphere, the warmer the climate gets, the worse impacts on everybody, including those fossil fuel companies. But because they make so much money, they're able to withstand a lot of that climate hurt. And same goes for agriculture. It's much cheaper to use synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and to overpopulate your farms with dairy cows, because if you have more of all of those things, then you are bound to make more money because you're able to sell more products. And so obviously those are major emitters because of the things that they do, but they also have the most scope to adapt.
With all these impacts that these corporations are having, one of the effects is, in fact, this wave, or at least this projected wave of environmental immigrants. How much do you know on that subject? And if you could, please tell us your experience with it.
I feel like I know quite little, and I think that's largely due to the fact that climate refugees as an overall title isn't recognized internationally. It's not a thing that you can claim asylum for, and that's because it's so hard to define migrating and immigrating for reasons of climate change. Sometimes it's a very active and future-focused choice. You know that your family's home is going to experience flooding because you are aware of climate change happening and you are in a wealthy enough position to go somewhere else. And sometimes it's quite literally a refugee type situation where your home has flooded or your house has caught on fire and you do not have anywhere to live, and the rest of the country is also experiencing that rate of climate disaster. And so now you have no other choice but to flee homeland. The overwhelming consensus, from my understanding, is that migration is the last option that everybody wants to invest in because of ties to land and home and things like that. I think it is incredibly awful that someone would have to migrate for climate-related reasons. So the conversation then is switched to, okay, how do we mitigate and adapt in places where we know climate change is going to be worse, where we know more homes are going to be underwater or on fire, or local habitat is deteriorating and there's no ability to grow crops because of drought and things like that. So I'm not a climate migrant myself. I don't know if I've met many, and that's, again, because of all of the issues with definitions and things like that.
Yeah, recently, I think I've read something where there was a international forum in New York where Antonio Guterres, the head of the United Nations, actually said to the rest of the world that they are not doing enough. In an age where we should be challenging things like climate change, it's simply just not happening. How true does this ring to you?
I absolutely agree with that statement. Obviously, the only reason that we have climate migrants is because we aren't taking enough action on climate change, and the effects are just getting worse and more people are having to take up that last straw of, okay, I have nothing else to do but leave. And I think obviously there's lots of global systems that we have to undo and rework and change and adapt in order to have climate change and sustainability and everything that comes with it prioritized. So Tony's right.
With so much information out there about the effects of climate change and how people are being affected, what do you think is the most important thing for the ordinary person to understand, and how can one actually make sense of all this information?
Yes, it's true that we're kind of oversaturated with information generally in the world. We live on a 24-hour news cycle, and climate change information is especially heavy because essentially everything is bad news. I think the most important thing that people should know is both that you as an individual contribute something and can change your own lifestyle and can do X, Y, and Z to alleviate your own climate anxiety and to take action in your local areas or even your national areas. But I think the biggest thing to know is that the reason it's so bad is because of companies and corporations and governments that have historically and continue to exploit nations and people and resources to a point that it's so unsustainable that our nation and our world is warming up at such a heightened rate. the whole phenomena of climate change exists because of mass industrialization coupled with capitalism and colonialism. It's this whole mixing pot of bad things together that have created the state that we're in. And I'd say play to your interests. If you're interested in science, look at the scientific processes of climate change. If you're a law kid, look at legislation and try and understand and unpack that. I think people respond best and do the best work when they're in environments that they enjoy. So as much as you can, make climate change something that you can now frame in a positive way and not in an overwhelmingly disarming and negative mind frame.
Yeah, I guess that must be extremely difficult, especially with this age of information. You get a lot of misinformation as well. Going back really quickly to your role as a youth activist, what's some of the most significant things that you have been a part of? And can you explain what was achieved through that?
I feel like everything that I've done, I'm not trying to toot my horn, but I feel like everything that you can do in the climate space is impactful. I guess I'm really proud of the work that I've done with the climate challenge. I call them my early years of climate activism because, they introduced me to such a huge world of not even just event planning and things like that, but the climate community globally is so small. And in New Zealand and in Wellington, it's even smaller. Once you're in it, you kind of know everyone already. And then the more people you meet, the more things you see them do in different climate spaces, which is really exciting. And they overlap in all sorts of different parts of your life. I think the thing I'm most proud of recently is obviously the founding of our organization, which is an incorporated society. We have legal status. We're able to take lawsuits. We're able to receive donations to take those lawsuits. We're able to engage internationally with lawyers from the States, from Pacific Islands, from, Australia, all these different opportunities. And we're able to do the work that we think is going to be quite nationally significant. So even though our most recent case regarding the Taranaki oil permits, onshore oil permits that were granted in the middle of last year, and judicially reviewing that decision to say that it was illegal and unreasonable and should be quashed, that judgment at the High Court failed. It was dismissed. And now we are starting our appeal a mere month after that decision came out. So the momentum hasn't been lost. And even with an upsetting outcome like that, we still received an incredible amount of press, both nationally and worldwide. It was really exciting to open those doors and generate so much connection and opportunity for everyone involved in our organization, everyone that we collaborate with. And it's gained a lot of momentum in terms of, okay, how can you affect change that will help the climate legally and through the courts? What does that look like? What is young people doing that look like? So I think that's what I'm most proud of with my team's work in that area.
Thank you so much for coming onto the show. That's Ri, Youth Climate Activist.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
And thank you for those who have listened. In case you feel that there are some topics not discussed to your liking, or you wish for another topic to be included, we will be having another climate change episode. You can contact us through NZIIA, New Zealand Institute of International Affairs Youth Panel. And you can find us also at the New Zealand International Affairs Youth Panel Instagram and Facebook page. So that is the NZIIA YP. Thank you so much for tuning in.